Okay, we left off the last time talking about China. We left off at the start of the the Warring States period, which is when about 7 of the different major landowning families in China rose up and overthrew the government, and basically went at civil war against each other for quite a long time. Goes on for about 200 years or so. The major problem is that these 7 different noble families, big landowning families, there's so many of them that no single one can gain the upper hand for a long time and defeat all the rest and reconquer all of China and set up a new dynasty. So they just keep going at each other for a couple hundred years. It's extremely bloody. Each of them trying to figure out some way, just desperately trying to figure out any way that they can to consolidate enough power and knock out all their rivals. They do a lot of different things. One group kind of perfects the ancient crossbow to try to gain a kind of upper hand in artillery, firing weapons from long distance. One general from one of the warring states had the idea that to send out kind of a decoy force against the opposing army. So he brought out a bunch of convicted criminals out of the jails from his own lands and told the criminals that they should march forward against the enemy army, and once they get nose to nose with them, that all the criminals should kill themselves, commit suicide. And that didn't seem like a very good, positive thing for the criminals to do. But the general also said that if you don't kill yourself right then and there on the spot, and you come, running back, then we will kill you, we'll execute you in even more horrible ways. So it's either you kill yourself quickly and fairly painlessly, or we will basically torture you to death. So the criminals, apparently hundreds of them, went marching forward against the enemy army, and when they got right up against each other, the criminals, hundreds of them all at the same time, killed themselves in a mass suicide that was so shocking to the enemy army that they didn't know what to do, that the general took his troops around the side and attacked the enemy army from the side, and they were so shocked at what had happened. They were caught by surprise, and the general won that battle. So there's all kinds of desperate, even sick attempts at trying to gain the upper hand over the enemy on the battlefield. The one group on especially this map here that will finally gain the upper hand is called the Qin. They come from the west of ancient China, and their nobles finally gained the upper hand by, number one, building a massive irrigation system to divert a huge amount of water from the river systems, even diverting major portions of the river itself into the Qin lands and into their farms, and distributing all the water amongst the crops. And by doing that, they opened up a new amount of farmland that had never really been farmed much at all, estimated to be about the size of today's Connecticut in the United States. So it's a gigantic amount of territory that is open to farming. So they're growing a whole lot more crops, so their economy grows, and the economy actually booms, because with all the new farmland, you need a lot more workers. So workers move into the area, and they start making more money off their labor. They start buying more clothes and whatnot. It's just a massive economic boom for the Qin state, for the Qin landowners, and they take those increased amount of resources and they throw them into the Qin military. So now they're going to start building an even bigger army than most of the other warring states, and that's eventually how they gain the upper hand. The Qin army is eventually estimated to be about 500,000 troops, about 500,000 troops. Just one Chinese warring state has that many, and that's about nearly as many as all of the Roman armies during the height of the Roman civil wars. So just one Qin state to accomplish that is a massive kind of noble government level reallocation of resources. And the Qin state, the generals used that army extremely brutally against its enemies, and even drafted peasants into their armies. Some of the other warring states were doing that also, building drafted armies out of their own peasants. But the Qin does something a little bit different. They offer social promotion, not just within the army, but within all of their society. That if you're a peasant who goes into the Qin army, that you could rise to get better jobs and higher pay, maybe even own some land, based on how many enemy heads you cut off on the battlefield. So suddenly the Qin peasants that are now becoming soldiers are unbelievably bloodthirsty, because if they cut off a certain amount of enemy soldier heads, then they'll get like social promotion. They'll get a raise out of it and a kind of jump in the class system. And you can imagine what the immediate results of that are. Does anyone want to guess? Yeah, it's exactly. It's just massacres, just an unbelievable amount of bloodshed. There are stories of the Qin armies now going out once they take prisoners in war. They execute them all. And it's not just the officers doing it, it's these peasant soldiers who want to go off and cut off as many heads they possibly can to get promotion out of it. And there's a legend of one battle that the Qin army won, where they took reportedly over 400,000 enemy prisoners and then massacred them all because of this promotion policy. So the Qin army becomes unbelievably brutal, basically takes no prisoners, and that seems to be its big advantage militarily over all the other warring states. The Qin nobles commit to what we today call total war, which is not just war against the enemy soldiers, but war against the enemy population, to either eradicate them or to convince them to give up as soon as possible. So some historians estimate that when the Qin went in and conquered some of their enemies, by the end of the war they killed 2/3 of the enemy population, and that's how they eventually went out. So after 10 long years of this total war, China is reunified under the Qin leadership, and they create a new dynasty that they call the Qin dynasty. And the dynasty is unified under the leader of the Qin state, who takes a new throne name, as they often did, and some kings still do today. They change their name when they get to the throne. His new name is Shi Huangdi, and that directly translates as the first emperor. So he viewed himself as the first emperor of unified China. And when we use the words, especially in ancient history, like unify or reunify, it usually means some kind of really brutal, bloody conquest, because most of these other peoples did not want to be conquered and looked to rebel at any good opportunity. So it took him about 10 years, he and his armies, but they eventually accomplished the so-called reunification by 221 BCE. And the Qin state, the Qin dynasty, is so powerful that this guy and his advisors do not want to make the mistake that the Zhou especially made in giving too much power to the nobility, because they realize that that's just a recipe for disaster. So Shi Huangdi's and his advisors' policy is basically to destroy the wealth and power of all those former nobles throughout the other so-called states. So basically, the Qin armies would go into another area and take the land away from that noble. And if that noble was willing to give his allegiance to the new Qin leadership, then they might allow him and his family to survive, and maybe even kind of allow them to govern the land that they used to own. But it's the creation of a hugely powerful central government. So even the local mayors and administrators and whatnot, they all answer to Xing Guangde and his advisors, his counselors. Any landowners that don't want to make the deal, who want to try to fight to keep their land, when they lose, he has them all killed. He has whole families massacred in order to make sure that no younger sons or nephews or anything would grow up to adulthood and try to get revenge by killing him, by killing the Qin dynasty leadership. So it's an extremely brutal stability that is eventually launched and destroys the nobilities. For those nobles that were allowed to somehow keep or profit off a lot of the land throughout the newly kind of reunified empire, another way of making sure that they could never rise up against this centralized state, this central dynasty, was to basically drain their bank accounts. And they figured out a pretty effective way of doing this. Basically, they would force any large landowners to own a very big and extravagant house in the capital city, with the theory that you should spend as a wealthy person, you should spend a lot of time in the capital city, and that while you're there, the emperor might at any time on any day decide to visit your house for lunch or dinner and visit with you and talk to you. And he doesn't want to visit a place that's a dump, so you have to keep a very kind of big, luxurious house. You have to keep it clean and well stocked with food and alcohol and all kinds of stuff. And that takes a whole lot of money to not just buy a big house, but to have a staff to maintain it 24 hours a day, every single day, year round. And that wasn't entirely meant to drain the bank accounts of the rich, so that if they don't have as much money, they won't be able to build up their own militias, their mercenary forces, so they won't have enough military power to ever threaten the central state again. And it's very successful, at least for a while. So going out and repressing them through, number one, just invasion, and number two, just destroying their access to wealth or their ability to keep wealth. Another way that the Qin state looked to control the society was by getting rid of certain areas of education that they thought were dangerous for their long-term survival, for the government's survival. And after a few years, they outright banned the studying, the teaching of philosophy and history, for pretty simple reasons. Anyone who studies history, studies the history of any civilization, comes to understand the similarities and differences between what's going on now and what used to happen before. And a lot of historians tend to argue sometimes that maybe the government today is making a radical break with our kind of past or our ancestry or the way things used to be done. And to say that could outrage a lot of the population, and that might start a revolt. And historians also often are very critical of what's going on now. They often say that things are getting worse compared to the way things used to be. Of course, governments don't usually like those kind of statements flying around either. They banned philosophy for largely the same reason, just like we talked about with Socrates in ancient Greece. So the basis of philosophy is a kind of fearless questioning of what's going on around you. Questioning what others say is true, or say what their motivations are. And once you kind of scale that up to the level of government, people who get involved in that kind of questioning often question government leadership and government policies. So philosophy can also be a very dangerous thing for governments to allow to exist in their societies. So they make it officially illegal to teach, especially Confucianism was outlawed as a branch of philosophy because the Qin government will use legalism, the very harsh, kind of brutal enforcement of laws. People are executed and punished in extremely brutal ways for committing what we would today think of as kind of minor crimes. And they viewed they viewed legalism, that hardcore enforcement, as the method of keeping social stability. That the punishment of crime is so severe that convinces people to not commit crimes in the first place. Whereas Confucianism takes the exact opposite stance, that Confucianism says you can build social stability just out of just civility and recognizing people's human rights and just adhering to the class system. So that's more your choice to follow kind of normal rules because it's good, not because you're going to be punished. So Shi Huangdi and Lisa and there are other leaders of the Qin state, Qin dynasty, were very worried that Confucianism is kind of the flip side, the exact opposite of legalism, and that Confucianism is just kind of pie in the sky, idealist, and it's dangerous. It's too kind of soft on society, that if you allow people to make their own decisions like that without some kind of enforcement from the state, then all society will collapse. We'll all be eating each other in the streets. At least that's what the government said. So they stick with the legalist enforcement, and anyone who dares to teach Confucianism or kind of some other philosophies in general, but also especially history teachers, they can be executed. And the Qin state will execute hundreds of scholars and teachers. At one point, they drag a lot of them right out of the schools and execute them right there in public. Some of them are even burned alive. So that serves as a pretty brutal example to the rest of society. This is what happens when you speak out against this government. This government is a hardcore dictatorship. It's a centralized state. And that seems to be the method of their staying in power. They're authoritarians. And a lot of people are extremely afraid of them, and afraid of being accused of committing crimes, because that could get you executed just by itself. The Qin state did do some, or at least kind of positive things for Chinese society. Remember that this is emerging out of 200 years of basically civil war that turned extremely brutal, extremely chaotic, extremely bloody civil wars. So a lot of the kind of roads and dams and a lot of different things had just been destroyed in the wars. A lot of the society had been destroyed in the wars. So one thing that the Qin government does very quickly after kind of consolidating their power is to launch off on a big infrastructure kind of rebuilding project. So they build a whole lot of new roads, a massive amount of new roads, or at least rebuilding the old roads that link mostly population centers and trade routes. Eventually, archaeologists estimate that they build up over 4,000 miles of internal roads within China, which is a massive amount within a fairly few amount of years. They rebuild a lot of irrigation systems to extend farming. Let's see the extent of a lot of the road network on this map here. The Qin dynasty also starts kind of consolidating and making consistent paths along this very informal trade route that is coming to be known as the Silk Road or the Spice Road or the Salt Road, depending on which textbook you look in, that is connecting on this map northwestern China to other routes that go all the way through northern India and eventually into Persia and on into even getting close to Arabia in the west in the eastern Mediterranean. So getting all the way to like Jerusalem and the edges of the Roman Empire. So they're that kind of informal bunch of different trading paths where a lot of Indians and Persians particularly have been kind of slowly trickling into northwestern China. The Qin dynasty sees that as a source of prosperity, so they start building up the connections from northwestern China to connect to that that series of trade routes. And the thing that the Qin dynasty is most famous for is doing a kind of similar consolidation of many hundreds of different forts along this northern frontier to protect northern China, northern Chinese villages against the Mongolian raiders called the Xiongnu, which you can see up here at the top of this map. That's what that word is, starting with the X, Xiongnu. So those are the Mongolian raiders who every once in a while come out of the desert and they launch those hit-and-run attacks against Chinese settlements along the northern frontier. And former dynasties and governments, they had, and noble landowners, they had built up forts kind of scattered around the northern frontier to house troops and be ready for counterattack against any Xiongnu raids. The thing that the Qin do is build a massive wall that links many of those forts along the frontier and built up new forts. So the wall connects them all and trying to keep the Xiongnu out, basically. And it is a gigantic building process. Takes 10 years to complete. It covers an estimated 2,600 miles, so 2,600 miles. And you have to remember that they're building this with kind of ancient technology, shovels and brick and mortar kinds of systems. So it takes a huge amount of time and a massive labor force. Historians today estimate that 2/3 of the labor force were convicted criminals. And part of their sentence was to be sent out to work on the wall. And if you're convicted and you're sent to work on the wall, a lot of times you never make it back. They work year-round, so it can get very cold up there in the wintertime, get very hot there, humid there in the summertime. So you get these extremes of weather, and the elevation differences along the route are pretty extreme. I mean, some of it is down at sea level. And the highest mountains are sometimes 6,000 feet in elevation, so in the wintertime up there it snows a great deal. It gets down to very cold temperatures. I mean, talking 0 degrees, and they keep working out in that. So it's estimated thousands and thousands of workers died on site in building the wall. So it took 10 years, and a lot of the legends say, and there seems to be some good archaeological evidence to corroborate this, that if a worker died while building the wall on site, they would take the body and they would use it for filler between the bricks. So they would just dump the body basically in the construction site and build the wall up around it. So a lot of the legend says that a lot of workers, maybe thousands of them, are actually buried in the wall itself and have become part of the wall. So it's a bad time to be committing any crimes during the Qin dynasty, because you can be sent off to this kind of labor that, I mean, you could be working there for years even if you survive it, and if you die, your family may never see you again. So it's a extremely hard labor type of a construction project. And it's said that this is one of the only human artifacts, man-made objects, that can be seen from space by astronauts without any kind of telescope. They just look down on the planet that they're flying over, and they can see the wall. So it's unbelievable. Back to the emperor himself. You can see, according to his years, he doesn't live all that long after becoming the emperor. He was middle-aged by the time he got to the throne, and his armies conquered the rest of China. But apparently his mortuary temple, his burial site, was the construction of it started pretty quickly after the end of the wars, and is eventually a very large kind of funeral complex, and took many workers, apparently by his own order. A lot of the Chinese people don't like him very much, view him as a tyrant, as an oppressor. So there are 3 assassination attempts against him, and he survives all 3, but eventually we think either by accident or by purpose. He was poisoned in his drink one night. So suddenly the emperor is dead, and they go to bury him. They bury him in this extremely elaborate tomb that was, I think it was built underground, if I remember right, and had things like a running river inside the tomb. So it had running water, and its location was supposed to be kept secret, and had all kinds of, reportedly, all kinds of booby traps laying around in the main hallway to get into the thing. So anyone who would try to break into the place to steal any of the emperor's wealth would be killed in the attempt. And that they wanted to keep the booby traps and the location so secret that the major insiders, the main architects who built the thing, were sealed up inside it when they finally shut the doors. So they were buried alive with the emperor in order to, maybe against their will, but in order to serve him in their last kind of act as living people. Apparently the Qin government, from the emperor on down, wanted to make sure that his ascent into heaven would be protected by a major Qin army. So they didn't want to bury all their soldiers with him, because that would, invite a revolution if there's no army left. So instead of burying thousands and thousands of live soldiers with him, the government order was for each soldier to sit down and have an artist make a statue of that individual soldier out of terracotta, which is a kind of statue material, building material. It's like a clay. So that each individual soldier would have like a very lifelike statue, life-size statue made of them. And eventually the plan was that to gather all those terracotta soldiers, the soldier statues, together and line them up like one of his armies getting ready to take the battlefield to fight, and that the statues would somehow like come to life in the afterlife and protect him and help him get into heaven. And you can see just by looking at the detail of just a few of these statues that each of the faces are different, the heights are different. They very often wear their hair the same, and that was a just kind of hairstyle. The uniforms are often the same, but these are very individual guys. Now you can see in the faces and the kind of body sizes and whatnot. So you can imagine the amount of cost just in material to make all these statues. I mean, thousands of them, and you have to pay the artists, the statue makers, to do it, and you have to pay the soldiers to stand long enough for the artist to kind of render their image in clay. So it's an extremely expensive thing. It was apparently kept secret from the Chinese people, this whole project, until after the emperor's death. Once the emperor dies, a lot of people want to overthrow this government, see this as a good opportunity, and so riots break out all over the place. And the next generation of Qin leaders try to figure out, how they're going to keep control. And apparently, one group of rioters, broke into one warehouse of the king's statues, the soldier statues, and were so angry, so outraged that the government's been spending money on this stuff instead of, better water supply or whatever the people demand, that they destroyed a lot of statues. I mean, broke the faces of the statues, tore them apart, and then set fire to the warehouse to burn it all down. So the people are extremely outraged that this thing has that this project has taken place in the first place. And with this image, you can see how big this is. Just one of the warehouses that have been discovered of the so-called terracotta army. And this wasn't even found until 1974, so we only know about this thing for the past 40 some odd years, past few decades. Most likely because the rioters hit this place and burned it down and expected the fire to have destroyed everything, and maybe brought the whole building down on top of it. But a big section of the building survived, obviously, and somehow got buried and was just forgotten about. So even later Chinese dynasties don't even know that this thing is buried right underneath their feet in some instances. So it was discovered by accident by some company, bunch of guys digging to make a well in 1974. And the Chinese government immediately understood how important this archaeological find was, and they brought in archaeologists and experts from all over China and all over the world to come kind of excavate this, and built an entire building around it to protect it from the elements. And you can see up on the sides they have walkways, and it's open to the public. It's like a giant museum. You could go in there and look at these artifacts, and just the scale of it is just amazing. And again, this is just one warehouse of the soldier statues, and it's estimated there were several others. So this is a kind of mind-boggling expense that the government took on to guarantee that the king could be protected in the afterlife. But Shi Huangdi died in 210. His heir to the throne tries to stay in control. Li Se, Shi Huangdi's head law enforcement guy, a big believer in legalism, he and the heir to the throne, they both try to retain control of the Qin dynasty and keep it going, but there's so much public outrage at all the oppression and whatnot that Shi Huangdi had led, that Li Se and the heir to the throne are actually assassinated in 206, and that allows that's the final straw, and the people rise up and completely overthrow the Qin dynasty. So the Qin dynasty is basically only about 15 years long. It's mostly Shi Huangdi himself, the first emperor, and the next generation tries to hold on, but they're wiped out by a popular uprising. And they are replaced with what becomes known as the Han Empire. So it's a popular uprising that overthrows the last of the Qin in 206. One of the major leaders of the rebellion declares himself to be the next emperor and starts a new dynasty that he calls the Han Dynasty, and publicly proclaims the mandate of heaven. So he takes the throne name of Han Gosu, and this is beginning of the Han Empire, the Han Dynasty. It seems that, at least in hindsight, that Han Gosu's number one priority was to return social stability and he wanted to get rid of a lot of the hardcore dictatorship that the Qin were known for. I mean, the Qin were a hated government by now, openly hated, reviled amongst the Chinese people. So the Han tactic is to end the massive amount of oppression against anyone who might criticize government, and especially to end the repression of the Confucians. So Confucianism is allowed to be studied and taught again. History is allowed to be studied. Philosophy in general is permitted again. And a lot of Confucians are actually brought into the Han government as a symbolic attempt at rebuilding stability through kind of civility, the Confucian idea. So some Confucian scholars are actually brought in to be head advisors to the government. So there's a lot of kind of Confucian ideas of humanity that the Hans are trying to use to rebuild society, but they do keep some legalist enforcement, especially of the most kind of heinous crimes like murder and rape and whatnot, theft of huge amounts of land, or embezzlement against the government. So there is a heavy law enforcement tactic against the worst crimes in society, but not all crimes. And that threat of enforcement against the worst crimes, combined with Confucian kind of humanity and civility, is seen as the real key kind of magic combination that the Han used to keep stability and keep themselves in power. And almost every other major dynasty in Chinese history has used that combination, because the Han dynasty rises to basically be the golden era of all of ancient Chinese history. It is the height of their prosperity and their power and their kind of cultural innovations and whatnot, and their ability to impact civilizations on their borders like Korea and Vietnam and Japan, and places to the west off the Silk Road. So even the Chinese government today proclaims a combination of Confucian kind of humanity and civility and respect for the higher ups, for your social superiors, and combines that with the hardcore legalist enforcement. So Gosu died after about a little over 10 years on the throne. Again, he's a middle-aged guy, and a lot of the Chinese leadership, they tend to not eat the healthiest food. They eat a lot of heavy meats and kind of fatty kinds of food, seafood, and a lot of them drink quite a lot of alcohol. So a lot of them actually die in their 50s from things like heart disease and other things associated with just having not the healthiest diet in the world. So he dies in 195 BCE, but the Han dynasty continues. Another major source of their stability is that Gosu and his inheritors realized that the best thing you can do to rebuild infrastructure is to make sure that the government appointees to run those projects actually know what they're doing. So they created what we today think of as like a civil service test, civil service exam. So that if you want to apply for a job to be like the head tax collector of the empire, or even the head tax collector of a certain city or a town, you have to pass a test showing that you know something about accounting and mathematics. You don't want to get someone in that position that doesn't know how to run a balance sheet, doesn't know how to balance a checkbook, basically. Because that can lead to all kinds of government problems. Or the same if you want to be a head bridge builder or dam builder or something like that, you have to pass a test to prove that you know something about architecture, that you know something about the mathematics behind it, that you can actually kind of drop a blueprint to build something that won't collapse. So the Han administrators are highly educated, because you have to pass this test to get the job in the first place, and it really starts with early childhood. Most children in the Han Empire get to at least go to what we think of today as elementary school, And the most talented kind of young kids as students are picked out in the elementary schools, and they're allowed to get promoted through, I guess you call it like high school and universities today, to get their degrees and pass the test, pass the written exams. And if you get through the high school system, the best of those students go to the kind of college system, and the best of the college students are the only ones that can pass the test. So there's a kind of weeding out process that starts from a very young age, and can bring in a lot of talented people into the government, because the government job is good paying, there's power, there's prestige, and there's a certain amount of openness and equality for a lot of the Chinese people at this point, because even if you're born into kind of a working class, kind of poor family, you as a kid still go into the elementary school system. You have a shot. You have a chance, if you prove yourself to be a good student, to kind of get promoted through the ranks. And if you make it to the highest level, you can be a government bureaucrat. And some of those government bureaucrats, if they continually do a really good job, they can get promoted to the highest levels of government sometimes, to be head advisors to the king, to the emperor. So there's a certain amount of at least equal opportunity in China under at least the early Han Empire. Questions about that at all? All right. Well, moving on. I guess skipping ahead a few decades after Han Gosu's death in 195. Another major emperor of the Han dynasty is called Han Wudi. He is on the throne for, it's almost 60 years, 55 years or so. It's quite a long time. And he makes some major changes to the Han dynasty, to the Han state, the government. Number one, he was interested in foreign conquest. So he will send the Han armies far north. You can see on this map, all the way up to the northern periphery, northeastern edge of China at that time, and they will invade down into the Korean peninsula and try to conquer Korea and kind of colonize it. The battle lines kind of go back and forth. They almost never get control of the whole peninsula, but that goes on for decades. He launches other armies south from the southern periphery of China down into what we today call Southeast Asia. On this map you can see that little label that says Vietnam. And the Chinese, the Han, will try to attack and conquer and colonize Southeast Asia, also to various degrees of success or failure. The battle lines again go back and forth. They'll conquer a certain area, and then there's an uprising of the indigenous people of that area who don't want to be conquered. So again, they never get control of all of Southeast Asia, but every once in a while they have control over large portions of it. And also in doing this, they extend Han Chinese cultural influence into those areas, into Korea and Vietnam, or Southeast Asia. Han Wudi will also launch another major war against the Xiongnu, the Mongolian raiders on the other side of the wall. And that one ends up being the biggest problem, because it's really difficult to launch your armies from the wall into the desert and attack the Xiongnu in their homes, because they can always retreat further into the desert. So the wars against the Xiongnu became particularly costly, and Han Wudi, kept demanding more and more invasions of the Xiongnu, and mostly not very successfully. So the wars become increasingly expensive, and they keep going on decade after decade, to the point where a lot of the Chinese people become outraged at the government. They basically accuse them of the government just wasting money and resources on these unwinnable wars. So Han Wudi becomes a very heavily criticized emperor, even out there in society. And it appears that he makes a decision that the only way he can really retain control over the empire, over all the Chinese people, is to bring back a lot of the kind of Qin type of repression of society, horribly punishing people who get out of line and question the government a little bit too much, and maybe start movements against it or riots or something like that. So it's the return of government repression against the Chinese population, and that went on even beyond his lifetime, getting closer and closer to year zero. So Han Wudi is a big kind of paradigm-changing emperor for the Han Dynasty. Okay, and eventually, getting really close, or even beyond year zero, there is one high-level administrator who becomes a regency leader. One of the emperors died, and the heir to the throne was basically an infant. So this guy who eventually becomes known as Wang Mang, he is a regency leader for a couple of emperors, and decides to overthrow them in year 9, so 9 years after zero, Common Era CE or AD. Overthrows the child emperor of Han China, proclaimed the mandate of heaven for himself, and basically said that he went to the Chinese people and said he did this in order to get rid of all that repression that Han Wudi had started, and that had continued down through the decades since Han Wudi had died. So it was a very repressive government, and Wang Mang overthrew it, and he claims to still be a Han leader, but that he's just setting the Han state back to what it was like when the Han Dynasty first started with Han Gosu. So there's some legalist kind of law enforcement against the worst crimes, but Wang Mang says he's mostly bringing back Confucianism into the government to bring back the humanity and the social support of the government. And in order to guarantee that the people are on his side, he starts off a major land redistribution system where he basically promises to break up a lot of the big land holdings of a lot of the old nobles, and give a lot of that land out to the working people and the poor, the farmers. And that got him a lot of favor, so he stays on the throne for a while. The biggest thing that challenges him is a giant flood of the Yellow River in year 11 that kills an estimated hundreds of thousands of people, just the flood itself, out in the Yellow River, kind of the countryside around the Yellow River. And that causes a giant controversy. I mean, this guy just claimed the mandate of heaven just 2 years earlier, and now people that were opposed to him, his political opponents, publicly start saying that heaven sent the Yellow River flood that year as a giant message to the Chinese people that he really doesn't have the mandate of heaven, and that people should rise up and overthrow him. So his kind of control over the society is pretty questionable for a while, and they actually do finally overthrow him in 23, so about 12 years later. So they finally get him. They decapitate him, they cut his head off, and they take his body out into a public square and they barbecue him, and they actually they eat the rest of his body. So there's a lot of kind of pretty kind of vicious move against him. It shows you the level of passion that this idea of the mandate of heaven can arouse in the people, especially if they feel like getting rid of someone could really benefit them and get heaven back on their side. So that starts off a crisis, and that is finally kind of a political crisis in 23. There's some infighting amongst different factions within the Han state, but it's finally kind of solidified, and stability returns by about 2 years later in 25. And the Han dynasty is kind of restabilized. So it'll go on for about another 200 years or so. The Han Dynasty in the so-called later Han era is not nearly as powerful as it was in the first half. So it kind of limps along for another 200 years. The greatest threat to the Han Dynasty seemed to be a series of more floods and like locust infestations that damage crops. And there's even a plague that hits China that seems to have come from the Silk Road. So some travelers from other civilizations seem to have brought this giant disease that killed off estimated millions of Chinese living at the time. The estimated population at the height of the Han Empire or the Han Dynasty is about 60 million Chinese people, probably by around year 0. And the plague wiped out a few million of them. So maybe 1 out of every 50 or so are killed off by the plague. So that's a huge amount of people of society. It's 2% of society, give or take. The plague seems to have convinced a lot of the Chinese people again that the Han had lost the mandate of heaven. So there's a big uprising against the Han that seemed to mostly be led by big landowners that want to knock out the Han and possibly build another kind of feudal system of big nobility families that own most of the land in China. So they might be looking to just knock out the Han leadership in order to split China up into another 7 or 8 or 10 or who knows how many semi-states. Apparently a lot of peasants didn't really want this at all. So the peasants rise up against their landowners at around the year 220. So the Han Empire kind of collapses in the midst of these different major factions, peasants and landowners versus the government. So it's like a 3-way fight, and that's what eventually kills off the Han government by about 220. So questions about the Han at all? I mean, again, they're still recognized, especially the early Han era, they're recognized by historians and even talked about it in their time as like the greatest era of all of Chinese history. Alright. Let's see, I guess moving on from here then. The collapse of the Han state in 220 starts off an even bigger round of civil wars. It's much like the collapse of the Roman Empire, that the Han dynasty was very consistently compared to, especially by historians today, because it was existing. Collapsed around 220, right when things start going pretty badly for Rome. But the Han dynasty, Han China, and the Roman Empire in Europe, they're basically existing at the same time. They don't have a lot of contact with each other, mostly through traders or travelers, or movement of goods back and forth. They seem to have heard of each other, but they don't really impact each other all that much. But they're often directly compared to each other historically, and you might see that in textbooks and documentaries and whatnot. But much like the fall of Rome a little bit later, the collapse of Han China, the Han dynasty, just leads to a collapse of all government authority, and it's really everyone out for himself, and creates a new round of civil wars that go even longer, by quite a wide margin, than the era of Warring States. Era of Warring States went on for just under 200 years. This one's going to go on for something like 370 years. So it's a massive, gigantic civil war that is just pretty incomprehensibly chaotic. It's unbelievable. It becomes so bad that the Chinese population falls from about their height of about 60 million in the Han era down to 16 million by the end of the Civil War. So it's massive amount of bloodshed, and probably a lot of that has to do with just a lot of people not having enough food to eat, and therefore a lot of children not surviving to adulthood. So reproduction in China kind of slows down dramatically. But to go from 60 million, 60, down to 16 is even over a couple centuries is a massive population shrinkage. And you can spend the rest of your life studying the details of this, what becomes known as the era of disunity. I like this chart because it kind of breaks this down into something that's at least kind of understandable in just a few minutes. Basically, the civil wars divide China into three general, very large regions that you can see up here in the top left kind of portion of this chart, this series of maps. So within just a couple of decades, China is broken down into these three different regions. Each of these regions have massive instability. So each of these areas could have something like 15 or 20 different factions in one area fighting it out for control. So it's extremely chaotic. So this would be like if you broke the United States down into three different regions, you'd have like 12 or 15 states each fighting it out in one region to try to get dominance over that place. So it's even more fragmented and fractured in China at this time than it was in the first round of civil wars before the Qin had come along. And historians, it's so difficult for historians to understand this because, much like the Middle Ages in Europe, a lot of people become so obsessed with trying to figure out how to survive this, to get enough food to eat and to defend their family from being murdered in the middle of the night, that they don't have enough time and energy to learn to read and write, and they don't have books, they don't have paper to write on. So literacy rates plummet also in China during this disunity. So one of the windows we have into trying to figure out what people are concerned about, since they're not leaving artifacts, written stuff behind, is to go to some of their legends that become famous at this time. Basically, historians argue that whatever the most popular stories of a certain era, or the most popular books, or even today movies, the stories that are told over and over again through generations basically means that they're popular because people recognize some kind of facet of their own lives in the stories, and that's why they keep retelling them, because they have a personal connection to the stories. And the most famous one coming out of this era of China is called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is basically a kind of soap opera type story of three brothers who take an oath of allegiance to attempt to reunify their area, and it follows their life stories basically. And there's all kinds of instances of like chivalry and bravery on the battlefield and all kinds of stuff, and like romance and backstabbing and all kinds of things. And historians analyze this story, which today has been published in many books and made into movies and kind of soap operas, made telenovelas, that historians say that the very fact that this is such a famous story coming out of this era tells us something about what people were worried about back then. That they were worried about instability, they were worried about backstabbing and continual warfare. So historians continue using that theory to analyze all kinds of stories from all over the world to try to get a kind of window into what that society was worried about or what it thought about, which, I don't know if we talked about this before, but it kind of scares me about what future people will think of our society, United States in the early 21st century, if they just get a list of what were the highest grossing movies over last weekend or the weekend before. I mean, and you look at how many movies have been made sequels of, which indicates to us that those movies make a lot of money. So keep making movies to make more money. I mean, why would people put down their hard-earned money to see the same story and the same characters over and over and over again? It's because they like it. And why would they like it? They see something of their own lives or their own worries in those stories. It speaks to them somehow. And that kind of worries me because, I mean, how many Saw movies have they made? I mean, something like 20 of them. And it's basically people just, you just watch these people be tortured to death for a while. I mean, what does that say about our society? What does it say about our love of violence or bloodshed? We find it that entertaining to keep going back and watching it over and over and over again and spending money to see it. Or with comedy, how many Jackass movies have we made and keep making money? And now they have like Bad Santa, Bad Teacher, and Bad Judge, and all kinds of things. It's why is immorality and just clown, stupid, fart humor like something that we so much worship in our society? But we'll see what happens. I guess you guys don't agree with me on that one, but that's okay. But I guess going back to the map, there were so many different, in the top right section, there's so many different groups in northern China fighting for dominance, that one of the landowners got the supposedly bright idea, figured that he didn't have a big enough army to conquer his neighbors, so he invited the Xiongnu into his territory, the Mongolian raiders, to help him beat the other Chinese landowners to take control of the north. And so the Xiongnu enter, and this happens several times in human history. They realize that they have a bigger army than any of these individual Chinese landowners, so they look around and they say, hey, it's a nice place you have over here. We'll take it. So they do. So the Xiongnu establish a northern control in this area that in the lower left part, kind of part C on this, one group of the Xiongnu create what they called the Wei Empire, the Toba tribe of the Xiongnu. So the Xiongnu take over the north and destroy a lot of those Chinese landowners, but the Xiongnu then basically break down to fighting each other for dominance. So eventually the Wei, the Toba group, gain the upper hand and create this Wei Empire under their own control in the north. And that's sadly one of the biggest sources of stability for China in this era of disunity. The Wei claim even the mandate of heaven. They heard that idea and thought it was useful for retaining social control. But a lot of the other Xiongnu, they try to keep fighting it out. But eventually the Wei, they build up their dynasty and they control the northern territory for quite a long time. That causes an outrage amongst a lot of the northern Chinese. And just by looking on the map in Part C, you can see that the Wei control the Yellow River area. So a lot of Chinese living along the Yellow River, at least that are wealthy enough and have an opportunity, they actually move out. They emigrate. They move south down to the Yangtze area because they don't want to be conquered by and controlled by what they view as a foreign occupation. And that happens every once in a while. Historians basically call it they're voting with their feet. They don't like the Mongolian Wei tribe controlling them, the Wei dynasty, and so they leave if they can. And that creates an interesting thing in Chinese history because throughout most of ancient Chinese history, the kind of centers of wealth and prosperity and culture in ancient China were located along the Yellow River. And now it's getting relocated. It's moving south. And it will stay there for a long time. And the Yangtze area is even today one of the cultural centers of modern China. Basically, it's not like the Yangtze area or southern China, even on this map, has any amount of stability. But there's only about 6 or 7 different factions in the southern area, down by the Yangtze and even further south, down to the South China Sea on this map. There's only 6 of the big landowning families fighting it out, so it's way, way, way less chaotic in the south than it is in the north. So the so-called 6 dynasties on this map was more stable than what's going on in the north or the far west at the same time. So, questions about that at all? All right, moving on. All right, so we're going to kind of continue talking about the so-called era of disunity. One of the big things that happen, another big thing that happens during these ongoing civil wars for centuries. I mean, people spend not just their lifetimes, but whole generations of people live during this this so-called era of disunity, this massive amount of infighting in China. I mean, 370 years is a long, long, long time. I mean, that would be like a civil war that starts in the United States now would not be resolved until, what, 2390? I mean, it's just an unthinkable amount of time. Or a civil war that started in, what, 1650 would just now be resolved. I mean, it's hundreds of years. It's just, it's an insane amount of time that most of us have trouble even wrapping our minds around. But another thing that happens in China during these centuries is that Buddhism enters China in a big way. Remember, Buddhism started in northern India. That's where the original Buddha was from. And so the religion has been, or the philosophy, or whatever you want to call it, has been developing in northern India for 700 years. And there's a northern Chinese, or northern Indian empire called the Kushan. And some of their emperors convert to Buddhism and want to see Buddhism spread to the rest of the world. So they send Buddhist monks, or missionaries basically, out of northern India. And on this map you can see them traveling eastward across the Silk Road. But they were also sent west. And eventually even down into Southeast Asia. But their most successful voyages were to come out of northern India and go north to the Silk Road and then go east into China. And they bring the Mahayanan form of Buddhism, which, if you remember when we talked about Buddhism in general, Mahayanan is the version where you have a whole lot of, like, Buddhism's been around for hundreds of years, so you've had Buddhist scholars and Buddhist experts who they say they get right up to the edge of their final level of enlightenment that will kind of get them out of reincarnation, to escape reincarnation. And a lot of these new Buddhas that become known as bodhisattvas decide to postpone their enlightenment so that they will be reincarnated, so they can live again and again and again, so they can have more lives to talk to more people and spread the Buddhist message even further. So they call themselves the greater vehicle because they're going to live more and they're going to talk to more people over many lifetimes, and that's what Mahayana means. It means the greater vehicle. But these bodhisattvas enter China, and they enter with government funding from the Kushan Empire. So they're coming in with money. They can buy up land. They can build temples. They can have statues and relics and whatnot made. And these bodhisattvas enter China basically being worshipped like saints. They're kind of worshipped almost like the idea with Jesus, that he sacrifices himself in order to help the rest of humanity. So there's the idea of this kind of self-sacrifice to help other people save their souls. Does that make sense? So the Mahayanan version is trying to follow the original Buddha's example of mercy and hope and love and compassion. And that combination, that message is very powerful when you combine it with government funding. The Mahayana Buddhists enter China as a kind of formal religion, and it becomes the strongest kind of, I guess, faction within Buddhism. So they come in and they start building monasteries, they start building relics and statues, and the bodhisattvas are kind of like priests and saints at the same time. And they come in, they build infrastructure in China, and they gain a lot of converts very quickly. And a lot of historians feel that it's necessary to kind of prove why this religion is so successful in China, or why this philosophy, or this version of the philosophy is so successful when it enters China. One idea is that the Mahayana kind of theology, the philosophy of Mahayana Buddhism, reflects a lot of Confucian philosophy, with but their shared emphasis on charity and helping others and compassion and doing good in society, and following the advice of your higher ups. These bodhisattvas are treated like saints with advice for people. That makes sense. So a lot of Confucians feel that this Mahayana and Buddhist kind of theory is basically very similar story to what they're already used to. So a lot of Confucians are very willing to convert to Buddhism pretty quickly. So Buddhism grows amongst the former kind of Confucian followers. Buddhism, when it enters China, is also very kind of similar to a lot of Taoism. So Mahayana philosophy and Taoist philosophy stress kind of meditation, getting rid of desire, getting rid of your greed and your worldly hopes for power and whatnot. And with this meditation, seems very similar to a lot of the Taoist focus on kind of passiveness, accepting the randomness of life and not complaining, so kind of being silent. So a lot of Taoists also convert to Buddhism. So Buddhism grows and grows and grows within China in this era of disunity, and eventually grows to be the major philosophical movement or religion of China even today. So more with historians, why do they think that Buddhism grows so quickly during this era? To the point that a lot of former Taoists don't even see the differences between Buddhism and Taoism. To them it seems so similar that it's basically the same thing. But historians also look at Buddhism as it enters China at this time of this massive civil war, and the civil wars, like a lot of civil wars, seem driven by greed and lust for power. So a message of getting rid of your worldly ambitions and your greed seems like a very positive message. It seems like it's a possible solution for the civil wars, to get rid of the bloodshed and rebuild peace and stability. Buddhism also talked about curbing desire and meditating in order to accomplish that, and that through this meditation you can achieve the highest enlightenment, which is a kind of eternal peace, and you can, in their view, avoid reincarnation. But just the idea of using meditation to achieve peace in your own personal sense can, if spread all the way across society, can end the civil wars themselves. I mean, it's hard to be a soldier going off and doing all this killing and also be heavily involved in meditation. Another argument the historians give is that the big landowners and the conquerors, like the Xiongnu, who go into northern China and conquer a lot of the Yellow River area, they like Buddhism. Especially, they like the Chinese people to accept Buddhism, because Buddhism talks about passivity, accepting things the way they are, not trying to change things, and accepting the kind of randomness of life. And that can be a very effective tool for governments, especially conquerors, to convince people to not rise up. If you're passive, that means you're not complaining. And if you're not complaining, you probably will not start a revolution. So foreign conquerors like the Xiongnu could have seen it as very useful philosophy to allow and support within the Chinese areas that they're conquering, because it undercuts the ability, or the likelihood at least, of a revolution. And the Chinese might come to accept their foreign conquerors. Other historians point at a specific Chinese guy who becomes a Buddhist, who hears about Buddhism and eventually converts to it. His name is Faxian, and they argue that he has a big impact because he leaves China, goes along the Silk Road, and actually travels into northern India in 399. Because he didn't want to have to trust translators. He was raised in China, so he spoke and read the Chinese language, but he didn't want to have to trust the Buddhist messengers, the missionaries. And he thought it would be more useful to go to northern India, to learn the ancient Indian languages that the ancient Buddhist texts are written in. By this point, about getting to be 900 years old. And he does that. He learns the ancient language, finds the ancient texts, and translates them into Chinese, and then takes the translations back to China by the end of his life in about 414. So he becomes a kind of Chinese intermediary, and gives open access to the Chinese people, at least those who know how to read and write, so that they can read the original Indian text for themselves. And so he becomes a kind of popularizer of Buddhism in China. And so Buddhism continues to grow, and even as the wars are continuing in the 500s, a couple of official kind of landowners, big state leaders within the factions of the Civil War, a few of them even convert to Buddhism themselves and declare Buddhism to be the official kind of religion of their holdings, and try to force their people to all convert to Buddhism. So Buddhism is growing and growing and growing by the 500s especially, and will have a big impact on future Chinese governments. So that'll take us really through the end of the era of disunity. And when we talk about China next time, we'll end the civil wars and talk about the rebuilding of Chinese dynasties, and take it from there.